Oh, okay. Good evening. Good evening, our listeners. Good evening, Christine. I'm so excited to be starting this month's series of webinars that are based on post-pandemic economic recovery for Africa, where we're trying to identify the challenges that the pandemic brought onto the continent, its level of readiness, and really try to come up with post-economic strategies or recoveries that the countries in Africa could try to, learn, take on board, and actually get to economic recovery. So before I introduce the topic in greater length, I'm going to ask my one panelist who's with me, Christian, to introduce yourself. Christian, over to you.
Thank you, Chido, for this, and it's great to be here in this discussion tonight. My name is Christine. I am based in Kenya. I am an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and I practice within various sectors of commercial law, but mainly within tax law. So I have quite good experience in areas on business restructurings and business remodeling to deal with these issues like the economic effects of COVID and other economic effects, especially from a tax perspective. It's good to be here so that I can give my input on this, Chido.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's really good to have a tax expert in the house. So I'm just going to give an introduction to the topic, which is basically going to be an introduction for the other three sessions that we have in the coming weeks. So historically, pandemics have generally had an economic impact that has lasted for longer than the virus itself. And I'm going to give three examples, and the third example being of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there was the bubonic plague or bubonic plague, whatever that they called it, of 1300. It was around 1348 to 1350, which left Europe's population even smaller than it was. A lot of people died. There were devastating impacts, social impacts, political impacts, and even economic impacts. The consequences of that plague were so much for the few people that survived, because it created labor shortages, there were higher wages, and there was the rise of Europe's middle class. Then after that, there was the infamous flu pandemic of 1918, which basically is, scientists have been likening to the COVID, or they rather they have been likening the COVID-19 pandemic to the Spanish flu of 1918. It infected about 30% of the world's population, killing between 3% and 6% of all the people worldwide. If you search in other statistics, they say approximately 2 million people died as a result of the flu. And the children that were born during the period were actually found later to have lower education attainment, higher rates of physical disability, and lower incomes were also experienced during that time. So basically, we have seen that each time there has been a global pandemic, there have been consequences that have exceeded the pandemic. And now, 2019, we had a case where the flu-like case was identified in the province of Wuhan in China, and in a short time that had spread out. I mean, COVID-19 needs no introduction, because that has become our daily lives, from the masks, the sanitizers, and so many government restrictions. So basically, already we have started experiencing the effects of the pandemic. Our healthcare systems have suffered in the continent. Governments had to step up to try and make up for the financial losses. But we also have had the rise of digital technologies. So the impact of COVID-19 over and above the death have been quite, diverse, I would say. But they are obviously projected to last longer than the pandemic. So basically, what we're going to be doing these 3 weeks, we're going to be forecasting some of the long-term effects that we probably not haven't started experiencing now, and trying to map a way forward for African governments to try and deal with those long-lasting effects, either positive or negative. So, Christine, this is to say, when we're now having this discussion, as I'm going to be engaging you in the next few seconds, don't limit yourself to the adverse effects or consequences of the pandemic. Rather, you can also tap into the positive, because in as much as there have been, the negative effects and people have died, there has been something positive that have come out of. So I just wanted to understand from your perspective, what have been the economic effects of the pandemic? And I'm asking for both positive and negative effects. Over to you, Christian.
Okay, Chido, thanks for that. And I will highlight some of the areas that would be a bit obvious. So, starting with tourism and the tourism sector, the catering and hotel industry, and as long and also accommodation. So one of the big impacts of COVID-19, like just the very nature of the virus itself, was the need to social distance and the need to limit how many people could be in a place at the same time. And this essentially meant that first there will be not much traveling. So countries that are very rely a bit on the tourism sector, that the hotel industries and the catering industries, that meant that there was a reduced inflow of guests coming to such places. And this affected significantly when you look at there are different towns depending on the country where there are tourism hubs. So, like in South Africa, Cape Town, and well, among other places, and then somewhere like Egypt, there would be a lot of tourism because of the ancient tours that people take there to view the history. And then, like in Kenya, there's the national parks, and there's like the Kenyan coast. And so all these places, so when you look at what COVID-19 did by the very nature of how the virus itself spread, then that sector was significantly affected. And I would say that was a negative thing. The positive thing I would say could come out of that is that there's been a more focus, especially by businesses that want to revive themselves, on attracting domestic tourism. Because you see, when an establishment or a place was relying a lot on international tourism, what COVID 19 did is that there was not much international tourism coming. But then domestic tourism can also be very helpful in sustaining the economy in times when you're cut off from like the international tourism. So I think that's something that businesses are exploring, and also encouraging people, like to tour, to actually also take a break from work and have go sightseeing and that kind of thing. But and then the second thing that I would like to say was a positive effect of COVID-19 on businesses is that there was a greater move towards digitalization. So you'll find that any business that had only a shop, that what they were doing is that you'd have to walk there to do shopping and to possibly, maybe make orders, you'd have to go there physically. Most of them found a way of helping people shop online, helping people compare prices online, helping people make orders online, get delivery by making calls or just placing an order online. So what that has done, one, is that there's a bit of transparency in the prices. So as a consumer, I'm able to compare the prices. I could go online and check on different platforms who is offering what, and therefore there's more information on how I can go about saving cost and shopping for what also I need in terms of not just the price but the quality. And then also at the same time is that the digital world, as much as there is less interaction of human beings, unlike I would have gone to a mall and I would have gone to, maybe have interactions with the person who is selling me a skirt that I wanted to buy or a dress. Now I have to order it and give the fittings and all these things. So there's also a cut off of human contact. But I think what the good thing about the digital economy is that there is greater potential for it growing. So I think starting with the first point that I made, maybe there should be a greater move and push towards maybe tourism, sightseeing, and maybe doing these other events that can link you more socially, which is not necessarily going shopping. Where if these things can be done, what can be done digitally, I would say let it be done digitally, and what needs human interaction, then let's look for ways of exploring that. Chido, I think I will stop at this point to get your input, and then I'll pick it up.
Thank you so much, Christine. You highlighted very important points that are very specific to the continent. You spoke about tourism and you spoke about the digital economy. I'll come back to that. But I just wanted to say, to talk about the economic impact of from a macroeconomic perspective. So the African Union did a study on the economic impact of COVID-19 on Africa, and they tried to divide the effects into two, basically into exogenous and endogenous effects. The exogenous effects basically were relating to the decline in trade between countries, the reduction of foreign direct investment, reduction of official development assistance, and foreign remittances. So there are countries like Zimbabwe that have benefited so much from remittances from South Africa, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, China, and countries like Australia and Dubai, and regions, and the UAE, because quite a lot of Zimbabweans are in those areas and they're working. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which had obviously an endogenous effect on a lot of people in those countries, in that they were no longer free to move around. The impacts of the lockdowns themselves had an effect, basically, on remittances, and those countries suffered. But then you hear of countries like Burkina Faso that generally had very low cases of COVID-19, but they have been affected extremely, economically, because of how the pandemic generally affected the region, or rather the world as a whole, in terms of FDIs, remittances, and trade. Just a moment, Christian. I seem to hear an echo from your.
Okay, Chido, let me look at that. You can go on here.
Okay, thank you. And you would realize that I think I might want to pick your mind on something, which was necessarily not a direct, in a way, COVID played a bigger part on that. But we had the oil situation that happened early 2000, like early last year, where the prices of oil really plummeted on the market. The Saudi Arabia issue that had also US focus. And we then had countries like South Sudan that basically are one of the largest oil exports in the region, suffering a projected decline in their GDP of more than 5%, right? And then we also had the trade war that was between China and the US. So I wanted to ask that if we then look at the adverse economic impacts of these 2 years that we've been in since the pandemic started, can we safely say that all of them have been as a result of COVID-19, or rather COVID just became the scapegoat where people would blame everything to COVID? But this economic decline has been has been happening slowly, or has been, how can I put it, has been somewhere within the horizon, just waiting for what I would say the tipping point to actually just get an outbreak. Because I would think that this is a situation, or we've come to a situation that has been brewing since the last time that there was a financial crisis in 2008, as a result of bad decisions and questionable policies, but then decided to take a dive just because the pandemic accelerated it. What do you think about that, Christian?
Chido, that's a very good question. Whether COVID just merely worsened the situation that was already there. It's not that COVID created the situation. And I would say that's quite true, I think, because when you think about it, like the example of Burkina Faso that you gave, they are suffering spillover effects of like what's happening internationally. But that situation did not arise uniquely because of COVID. Because when you look at it, and we've mentioned this before, is that if an African country is relying on foreign aid to fund its budget, and now what you're doing is that instead of trying to look for local resources and also to run your country in a way that you can profit from the resources that you have and that you can support your local businesses so that you're able even to collect taxes from them, and rather and rather than do that, you take foreign aid to be the sole source of your funding for the government. Maybe 80% of your budget comes from foreign aid. So when COVID comes and now there's no, first of all, aid coming from these countries because even they are also hit by the pandemic, or there's not much um, loans that can be extended because you're defaulting, because the little that you could get locally, you're now not even getting it because of COVID. The situation gets worse. But when you look at the core reason on what really is the situation, you realize, for instance, is that you've been relying on foreign aid. And then the other example I would give is also that domestic industries for most African countries do not necessarily produce goods that are at par with like goods that people within the country would import. And what I mean is that consider something like masks or gloves, which anyone could have produced of a quality. That's what we later came to realize that is acceptable. All the while before COVID, most people imported those. Most people, instead of the local industries manufacturing them, we opted to import them. Later on, when COVID struck, we realized, that there are domestic companies that can make hand sanitizers and make it of good quality. There are domestic companies that can make the masks and the gloves, but all the while those were being imported. And so you realize that there's also that part where domestic industries, either they were not able to operate within the markets that they were in to be able to produce goods that can benefit the economy way in advance before COVID, and therefore the economy could not have been pushed further. But then with COVID now, we are realizing that this is a gap that existed. It's not that COVID brought the gap, it's that it just brought to light what had been the situation. And then I would also give an example, even what I said of like tourism. It's when COVID came that you realize that how much hotels were relying on international tourists. And when you think about it, travel advisories have always been issued. So you hear, like, for instance, the example you gave, like where there's a trade war between like China and the US, or the US and a different country, and most times the outcome will be there's a travel advisory that's given, like the citizens of the US don't go to this country, and now again the tourism sector in such countries was being affected. So someone could have projected on what's the likely impact whenever these international tourists don't come on these hotels. Whenever, like, for instance, there's a terrorist attack in any of the African countries, and there are those countries that are more prone to terrorist attacks than others, there's a travel advisory given. And what happens is that the tourists don't come especially from Europe and the US, and the hotels suffer. And then again, COVID comes, and we are at a loss on what happened. Yet we could have seen, if these international tourists never came and we were relying on them, then we are really bankrupt as businesses. So, Chido, I think, like, looking at those examples that I've given, I agree that the situation always existed in some of these areas. It's not that COVID is what created these problems. These problems most likely existed, and what happened is that COVID worsened them or brought them to the forefront, where we can clearly see and we can clearly analyze and say, you see, here is the issue, here is the issue. And now I think in this discussion, as we are looking for strategies on how to recover, I think is to also seal those loopholes. So if, like, domestic companies are not able to manufacture and produce to support the market, and this could be things as simple as food security, because you see, over the COVID period, there was a lot of imports were not coming in to most countries. So now what happened to issues like of food security? Like were people being fed? Did people, yes, and where did this come from? Local industries had to pull up and to push and to try and produce to cater for the demand in the market. And then what also happened to like producing certain maybe medicine that was required, or maybe like hand sanitizers? What happened when we couldn't import them anymore? Local industries had to pull themselves up and try and manufacture and meet the demand in the market. So, simply what I'm saying is that starting from the domestic companies, a recovery strategy that could arise is to empower them, to strengthen them, because multinationals, as we've now learned, but we have always known, is that we really cannot rely on them to meet all the needs that we have. So that now, if for instance Google is not supplying a search engine within Africa, then that day, I mean, there's no one who is working, who is online doing anything. That's when you realize, how much we are over relying on solutions that are coming from a multinational, which if they decided to shut down and leave, then what does that leave us? And I think there are a lot of opportunities that Africa could explore, especially like within the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. There's no reason why Burkina Faso should be suffering as it is when it could have been trading with a neighboring country. So Chido could go on this, but possibly you could take it up.
Thank you. Wow, that's amazing. I wanted to move the conversation again in a slightly different direction. So there has been so much talk around post-economic recovery. I know that this whole series is trying to come up with strategies for post-pandemic recovery. I mean, a lot of papers have been written, a lot of conferences have been attended. From different perspectives, trying to come up with strategies for economic recovery. And I think in theory, we do have more like a way forward. We do have the blueprint of what a lot of African countries have to do on the ground to make sure that the economies pick up after the pandemic. But I am more concerned rather with this whole concept of if the pandemic is to continue for the next 3 years. I'm saying this because heavy focus has been on the pandemic. As it ends, we have to start implementing A, B, C, D, and E, because that's our post-economic recovery. But my question is, how ready is Africa, or how ready are African countries how ready are they to actually continue in this fight against the pandemic if it accelerates and if it also prolongs for more than a year, 2 years, 3 years? Because what I understand is when it started, and scientists from all over the world were likening it to the Spanish flu, they basically were anticipating this pandemic to probably run for a period of 2 years, just as how the Spanish 1 year, 18 months, 2 years, more or less around the same time frame as the Spanish flu. But right now in South Africa, there are talks of the fourth wave, right? So I don't know how ready are African countries, to deal with this pandemic if we get to the 6th wave, the 7th wave, the 8th wave. I understand that quite a lot of people in a lot of countries have been vaccinated, and there've been again conversations around, if you're vaccinated, Christine, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are completely immune from catching the virus again. You can. It could be fatal. You could die. It's just a lot of unknowns. And I'm coming from this perspective that I remember reading an article that that's titled I think why we didn't build, or why we don't build, or something, basically saying governments are not building stronger institutions. They're not building the relevant infrastructure just because they don't want to, right? Because if you think about it, even in Europe, no one was ready for the COVID-19 pandemic. No health system in the world was ready for this pandemic. But you have places like China where they had to build hospitals in the shortest record time, right? But then the question becomes, if the funds were available, the same funds that governments had to disperse trying to make the COVID-19 grants and all these other poverty alleviation schemes, right? And all these other grants that were put towards beefing up, I would say, the health sector system. Why were not those funds not initially used to try and capacitate the healthcare system prior to the pandemic? Not necessarily saying, okay, people were supposed to project a pandemic, but generally we were lamenting the issue of infrastructure. Even if we could take the conversation back to trade, right, you'd realize that a lot of borders in Africa suffered. There were so many delays and a lot of there was a lot of financial implication on that, because we still do not have the adequate infrastructure for trade facilitation. So basically, COVID came, like you said, and opened everybody's eyes to the problems that have been underlying. So it's a low-hanging fruit, but there have been other issues. And my question is, why are we still not building as a continent? If the pandemic is to probably get worse, and we now have to all go in under lock and key, total shutdowns and whatever, are we ready for that? Given that we've already experienced it before and we've already started talking about these lessons, are we ready for that? Or we are basically focusing all our energy on post-economic COVID recovery, where we do not know whether the pandemic will ever end or not? I don't know what you think about that, Christian.
Wow, Chido, I really like what you just asked, because you see, recovery, I think, is also means that you have to deal with the situation as it is. So the situation, and as you highlighted, the situation as is that COVID is still here, and as you say, there is likelihood that there's going to be more and more waves of it. But which African country is building hospitals right now? Because we are still within the red zone. Maybe the color red has decreased in its in how strong it is in its saturation. But we're still within the red zone, because it's not like the COVID pandemic has been completely done away with. But which country is equipping itself, as we know right now, where we can point out and say, wow, see, like the example you're giving of China, within a short period of time, they built their hospitals. Sure, there's been an increase, like as I said, of domestic industries trying to meet the gap of giving protective wear. But which African country has come up with a vaccine and is manufacturing that vaccine right now, and is like making it for its own citizens, because it's realizing to recover we need to deal with the situation that is right now. Because even as we are saying about a recovery strategy, one of the recovery strategy is to deal with the current situation, because to get to recovery you actually have to go through the period that we are in right now, which is that there's still the virus that's going on. And as you see, most African countries, if you ask me, and from observations, seeing as to be fair, is that the COVID pandemic did not impact African countries in terms of like deaths as they did other continents. And I think that's why, to answer your one of the questions that you asked, why possibly there is not much panic to build hospitals, to like change lifestyles, and to have the government putting up strong social security and social support for like the vulnerable and those who cannot afford basic needs. So the reason why is because I think we really were not hit the hardest. So you find like for some countries, there was those who like in the heat of things, they were sending like support, some not much amount of money, but a little amount of money to households, that so they could buy basic needs. That has since ended. I don't know of many countries that are still giving support, and for just families who have been affected by the pandemic. What actually has happened is that people have been retrenched, people have lost jobs, companies have shut down, and now when the situation is as is, people are not getting the support that the government will be giving them. Rather, the government is now relaxed, because they're saying, you know what, the pandemic seems to have done its worst, which again is just maybe almost like a wish, and we were not affected as much. So, Chido, I think it's important also, I think, to answer that question is, to recover, we actually need to take steps towards it, because we are not at the phase where we have completely done away with the with COVID pandemic as is, like the pandemic itself, so that now we could start speaking about recovering because we are fully cured. We still have the disease, we still have the virus, and we are not cured of it. So that now we could start saying, like now we could start doing this and doing that. We are fighting it as we are recovering. But I think the fighting it, I don't think there are enough economic measures that we can point to and say, wow, see that how we are fighting it even as we are recovering. Because if I think we jump to the step where we start saying let's recover without putting measures to fight it, we may actually not get to the recovery that we are hoping for. So, Chido, I hope I've somewhat touched on what you raised.
Yes, you have, and you have answered so well. Thank you so much, Christine. But unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I'm just going to ask you to probably wrap this up in 30 seconds. And then we say goodbye to our listeners and hope that they join us for the next discussion on Friday.
Chido, thank you very much. And I think to our listeners, what I would say is that we have this series going for the month of November, and we would like to hear many different views on what you think is happening within Africa, what you've observed, and what you suggest should happen, both to address the intermittent situation that we're in and the post COVID recovery period. And it will be nice for people to participate in this discussion so that we get at least some varying ideas and suggestions on this topic. But Chido, thank you very much for being part of this. And for me, that's all I will say for today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for saying my line. where I ask people for the comments, suggestions, and to keep the conversation going on our various online platforms. But for now, it's goodbye from both of us, and thank you for listening. See you.